wanted to maybe pick up a little bit on this idea, like I think you mentioned gradients.
Yeah.
A lot of, I think, what you presented to us does illustrate the complexity of meaning making. And it did seem to me that there's a sort of a qualitative difference between the Cleveland Indians image and what it might represent and the effects of that versus the Pontiac one, where you have a hero and then you've got a bloody car manufacturer trying to sort of tag on to those qualities. And it seems to me that diminishes Pontiac, that diminishes the name and the reputation of this person, to the point probably where many people today don't even relate it to a native person. It's just a car. And you see that a lot, I think, with automobile manufacturers. One of my pet peeves is cool names of beautiful places, like a Denali that's attached to like a huge SUV, which is probably run on Alaskan oil that's being extracted from Denali or something like that, right? So it just, for me, it shows how meaning is looking in all kinds of different directions often, right? It's glancing back at origins, it's also connected to present time, and it creates these other interesting effects, I think. I've said too much.
No, that's right. And I think over time, the image has become less obvious. That the meaning has become less obvious, but it's more insidious. It's more, it's more harmful in some ways because it's not as obvious to us. We can look back at the image, some of these like this, and say, well, this is bizarre, right? I mean, who would wear this mask in the first place? But now the images and the presentation of the images seems to be, this is all peace, love, groovy now. And in fact, it's far from that. A child of the 60s.
Ian, you was surprised.
Yeah. Yes.
I think, Keith, we see that even here in town with Koltai Elementary School. While I believe there was some discussion with Snuneymuxw, and there is a totem in the classroom or in the foyer and plaques, the whole concept of Koltai and his history is fraught with misconceptions, because what he did in fact was assist the advancement of colonialism.
In a way, I don't think that was probably his intent, but yeah.
No, but also claiming to, there was a claim there that he owned the coal, which was really a misconception. It was the coal of his people.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. And that's the other thing that gets advanced is sort of that's what I think liberal Canada does, is this advancement of individual ideals as opposed to communally held property and those kinds of things that aren't recognized. I think there was someone over here first.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for your presentation. There's a lot of things there that give me a lot to think about. I'm speaking as a Canuck. And I think I'm grateful for
as a what? Sorry.
As a Canuck.
Okay.
I'm a non-Aboriginal person. I've only recently come to Vancouver Island, but I've lived among First Nations Aboriginal people in northern Ontario and the Arctic for the last 45 years. The question I have is, looking at your presentation, most of the cartoons and things that you show are from the United States rather than from Canada, and they're also dated. You go back to the 50s and turn the previous century and so on. And my impression is that in Canada, we've had a lot of information that's really jarred us as non-Aboriginal people in the last number of years. A lot of stuff about the treaties, for example, the whole residential school debacle and the damage it's done to generations of First Nations Aboriginal people. And the question I have is there any kind of a distinct difference in the mentality of Canadians generally as opposed to those south of the border in the States? What is not acceptable any longer in Canada on a broad scale, and how are we learning and growing, and what are some of the blind spots there?
There's a whole lot of questions in there.
Yeah.
Tell us, Keith.
Should write them down. I think that historically, Canada has been better at hiding its intent. I think the United States historically is in some ways more honest. The cavalry came in and said, move out of your territories, where in Canada, we just legislated them away from their territory. So the intent is the same. Maybe Canadians have a better handle on their own, who they are. In the United States, still think there's weapons of mass destruction in that, probably. Yeah, I don't know that we're better. I think it's more, again, I think it's more insidious here. And the images are still being used, and you're right, I'm pretty loosey-goosey with the timeline here, and I'm just trying to make a point with a limited number of images. But it's still used in advertising. Indigenous people are still used in advertising in Canada. Again, they're presented as being positive, but as Ian said, those things aren't necessarily positive for Indigenous people, or for our understanding of this sort of cultural relations, how we get along together. So, I don't know if I've answered your question or not, but
Thank you.
yeah.
Well, I'm just curious, and I know that both you and Allison sort of present some of this in our First Nations studies, but it's just that idea, Indian is still a word that's used, it's a creative thing. I just kind of wanted to link a bit of the material you were presenting in the beginning of the statistics, this research made up thing, and the idea of this imagery that's carried through our culture, right down to the class thing where I is. Yeah.
Well, the whole idea of Indian is a constructed thing in the first place, right? Somebody got lost and showed up in North America or in the Caribbean and called everybody Indians, and just made a geographical error there, and it's carried on. But now the name has legal meaning. It's a legal term now in Canada.
Well, but I find it interesting in that there's a legal definition, of these research links, and then in another way, the media now, through imagery, creates this, that as you put, sort of juxtaposed, there's this sort of lived life that's really not a representation of it, and then we have this fantasy imagery. And I'm just wondering, what are the links, or where do we move forward in that, deconstructing some of this imagery and redefining what Indigenous people are? Because I even noticed in our language a few times we're shifted to the word Indian rather than Indigenous or First Nation, because we're so encultured, rather than the name or India. But I was just curious where you saw if there were any links between that early study and the silent media messaging that we now have.
I think it's all simulations, and there's an author named Gerald Visner, and he talks about that right from the very beginning, that these simulations have taken the place of real Indigenous people. That you can't come to know Indigenous people because there's all these simulations in the way. So that then that's the common link right through from I think way before the time I talked about from contact to the present, is that there's this foggy screen of simulations that you have to try to get through in order to have this relationship with actual living people. So I think that's the connection.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for that presentation. What I think that those images do still today is they create the two narratives that our society kind of depends on. One definitely the savage, and one is the romantic, the notion of the savage. And that one image about respecting Earth and all the pollution, all that kind of stuff, that was an Italian actor.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So other people other than us can portray us better than us.
Right. Well, and the Pocahontas piece too. She was the model for that. Apparently, and Nelson can help me out if I'm wrong here, but the image was actually a Eurasian woman who played in a TV series called John Woo's What's a Thief, and she plays an Asian, but in this she's the model for apparently the model for Pocahontas. Who's, if you look at, I didn't go into that, but if you look at the character, she doesn't look like the actual painting of Pocahontas on the other side. Yeah.
Indigenous actress Irene Bedard was the original
Oh, was she?
model, and then
Okay.
the corporate structure decided that she wasn't pretty enough.
No.
But she does the voice. She does the voice
She
of
does
the
the
voice character. Irene Bernard.
But even more contemporary, the Twilight series of movies, which was a big hit, one native character in there is played by a white actor as well. So it continues.
Continues today. Thank you.
actor in there, or the guy who's supposed to be the native
He's
character
not.
is not native.
He's got a German background, I think.
And for a black girl, the young woman, the
Oh,
lead.
okay. I think John first. No?
Mine was
I was just going to say, a lot of your images have come from the print media and the press, and I mean, it really still continues today so negatively. Whenever I read something, usually about First Nations people, it's usually something negative, like the chief of a band is spending $200,000 a year doing whatever. You never hear about the good things. And I suggest next time you have a drink of Incomeat wine from a Soyuz, or look at the vineyards in the Okanagan, which are 25% on First Nations land, that you think of positive things.
Right, that's right.
And, you know, it just seems it's always the negative things. And I know people that I'm shocked when they sometimes say something about a First Nations person. Negatively, I think, you know, where is this coming from? And it's usually from the press.
Yeah, I think you're right. But I think it goes beyond the press as well.
Yes,
It
yes.
does. I mean, the press is, the press is
But
us.
they're
The
a
press
big
is,
force
Yeah.
in forming
you're right.
people's
Right.
ideas.
And there's, in Canada, maybe it goes back to the other question, but in Canada there's a tendency, I think, to do a lot of window dressing, you know, to put up totem poles or to do whatever to try to say, you know, we're all in this together now, but in fact, that's all it is. Angel?
I do have a couple of things. Oh yeah, this young man is actually before me.
Oh, sorry. Which one? Oh, sorry.
Have you ever heard of the Dead Dog Cafe on CBC?
Yeah.
They like satirize all these
Yeah.
native issues and stuff. And I found when you said like Pocahontas, and they're satirizing how Native people are live targets for the arsenic practice on or something. And I felt that show kind of put some of these issues out there in a way that kind of showed how some white people have prejudice against
Yeah.
Native people in a way.
Yeah, it was a great series, and Thomas Kane. And one of the series they did is why it's good to have Indians in Canada. Was one that I remember, and so that Canada can be seen as an imperialist power, like the big players.